Magnus Carlsen has just got through smashing up Anish Giri in round 2 of the Tata Steel tournament. Now this was some seriously deep World Championship prep, so wait till you see this. Magnus had white here and Anish had black. Now it's always a bit spicy when these two play. They've had a few Twitter spats in the past. Giri's often been a bit in Magnus's shadow with everything he's achieved. So it's good fun when they meet at the board. Who knows what's going to happen, but Magnus tends to get the better of it, as we've seen down the years. So Carlsen goes for this Catalan system, which we see defined by this G3 move, preparing to fianchetto the bishop. Now Giri goes for bishop e7 here, bishop g2 from Magnus, castles, castles, and pawn takes on c4. All standard stuff. We saw a lot of this in the World Championship match between Carlsen and Nepo. Now we had knight to a3, so a bit of a sideline here. Really interesting way to play. So you want to take that pawn back in 1. Giri doesn't allow that. He plays the common bishop takes knight here. The pawn recaptures. So you've shattered these pawns as white, but in compensation you've picked up the bishop pair, and you're going to get dynamic play, as we'll see, down the b file and with the bishop coming to a3 like this. So the bishop now came to d7, and we had pawn to a4 here from Magnus, a multi-purpose move. He shuts down b5 for the time being, and also prepares bishop a3 as mentioned. So we had bishop to c6 now, coming to that nice diagonal, bishop to a3 hitting the rook, rook to e8, and queen to c2 now, preparing to collect this pawn here. So Giri develops the other knight into the game, and now Magnus takes a timeout with rook a to c1 before taking this pawn. You can't go knight b6 straight away as black, or pawn to a5 comes, so you're still going to pick up this pawn. And by moving the rook across, we'll see that Magnus is setting up a really interesting deep idea. So we had pawn to a6 now from Giri, really standard in these structures, maybe going b5 later. Magnus picks up the pawn here, knight to b6 picks up a tempo, and now queen to c3 from Magnus. It might look slightly curious to put the queen there instead of on c2, but if you put it on c2, then black can take this pawn with the bishop and pick up tempo against the queen. It kind of forces this move, queen takes on c7, there's maybe some other options, but after this, rook takes, this isn't what you want as white. And you can't take here on b7 because, say, after knight f to d5, you have to bring this rook back. If you took on b7, bishop to c6 is strong. So coming back here, you don't want to go into all this. You're not looking to liquidate and equalise. Magnus is pushing for more. So that's why he comes back to c3 here. This means that the knight takes, and although you lose a tempo on the queen when it comes to b3, you force this knight out to a4, and it's kind of out on a limb here, as we'll see. Amazing play now from Magnus, watch this. So queen to d5 from Giri, really logical, you're looking to trade off the queens. Let's not forget that black is a pawn ahead here. But Magnus has an absolute thunderbolt of a move prepared in response. Rook takes on c6, an epic exchange sack. So what is going on here? Well, if you take this queen first, then after pawn recaptures, now you don't have time to take the rook, or you're losing the knight here. So that's why after the rook takes on c6, black has to recapture with the queen. Again, you can't capture with the pawn, because when queen recaptures, it holds the knight on a4. That's key in a lot of these variations. This knight is really stumbling around. And now knight to e5 comes, hitting the queen, continuing the initiative. Giri comes into b5, trying to trade off, but Magnus is having none of it. Queen to c2, pressuring down the c-file still, and asking black some uncomfortable questions. And probably best here was knight to b6, just bringing that knight back into the game, giving this b7 pawn, which is probably best for Magnus, and trying to hold on in this position. But after the move knight f to d5, which blocks this diagonal and also preserves the c7 pawn, Giri is now in a lot of trouble after Magnus's rook to b1. Really great move, continuing the initiative and kicking the queen around. So it comes into a5 here, holding on to this knight. And now I'd encourage you to pause the video and think how you'd continue this position here. And if you're enjoying these videos, then do hit that subscribe button to never miss another. Now you don't want to play rook takes on b7. This would be imprecise because now the knight hops back, shutting in that rook and opening up the queen's eyes to attack this bishop here. Instead of this, Magnus recognises that he needs to give up this light squared bishop, because after the pawn recaptures, you have to hold the knight so the queen can't take. Now we had rook takes on b7. And once again, it's just really hard for black to get these pieces back into the game. So Giri tried pawn to c5 here, looking to undermine the protection of this knight. But queen f5 was a very precise response from Magnus, showing Giri that he has to be mindful of this f7 weakness. So the rook came back to f8 defending, but now Magnus crashed through anyway with knight takes on f7. Now the queen dropped back to d8 here, a nice idea from Giri, so that if Magnus takes this one, then you take here as black, and actually, although white's a bit better, black is doing okay now. You'd have to preserve the knight, rook f7 might come, challenging this strong piece, and it's tricky, who knows what's going on here. This knight may be coming back into the game now, which isn't what you want as white. So instead of this, after the move rook to queen to d8 rather, Magnus took on c5, and he takes with the pawn because he wants to keep this knight as shut out of the game as possible. So we had queen to f6 now from Giri. He is able to swap off the queens now, which is forced. The pawn recaptured, and we had knight to h6 check. The king tucked away in the corner, and pawn to c6 now from Magnus, opening the bishop here, and this pawn is getting really dangerous as we can see. So the rook came across to blockade that pawn to c7, and now knight to c3 here. Giri desperately tries to bring it back into the game, but it's too little too late at this point. So bishop came back to b2, and now don't take this pawn here, or after king f1, that knight's actually got nowhere to go, it's completely gone. But also we're threatening to take on f6 and checkmate the black king. That would have been a really pretty one. But we didn't have this on the board. Giri recognised this and played pawn to d4 here. And now we had knight to f7 check. The king came to g7, and the reason you're helping the king come out is because now you go knight to d6. You've used that tempo to bring it into this powerful square, and you're hitting this rook, of course. You're going to win back that exchange. So we had king to g6 trying to activate the king. It's very difficult actually for Giri to find moves here. We had king to f1 from Magnus, just holding this pawn, although it wasn't so much of a threat to take it really from black. Knight to b5 now from Giri, so this does force Magnus's hand. He does take the exchange on c8, the rook recaptures, and although black is winning this pawn on c7 after pawn to a4 here, when the smoke actually clears on these tactics, because Magnus picks up this one, we'll see that black is just in a world of trouble after bishop e3. The knight is completely dominated by the bishop, as we can see here. White is 2 pawns ahead, and this is just way too much. It's a lost endgame. Giri actually resigned here. So phenomenal prep there from Magnus. Giri just walked into an absolute Catalan crush, which clearly had been prepared for the World Championship. If you enjoyed this game, then do hit here to subscribe and never miss another, and see another amazing epic chess game, click here. Thanks very much for watching, and see you soon.